The file said deceased. The ledger said sold. He lit the match before anyone else could open the drawer. The flame was a hungry living thing in the stale dark of the records room, a single orange tear in a world of gray paper and black ink. Micah Dunn held it to the corner of the docket sheet for Gallatin County, year of our Lord 1888. The paper was dry as bone, brittle with forgotten lies. It curled, blackened, and caught. For a moment, the name was illuminated one last time. Isaac Dunn. Charge, vagrancy, disposition, deceased. A lie written in the neat, looping script of Deputy Clerk Miller, a man who took pride in his penmanship. Micah had learned that hand, apprenticed under it. He had mixed that same ink, filled those same pens. He had believed in the straightness of the lines, the finality of the words. He had believed in the law they recorded. The fire climbed the page, eating his brother's name, eating the lie. It was a small fire, a secret fire, but it felt like the sun coming up in his chest. He shoved the burning docket back into the metal drawer, a sacrifice to the god of sealed records. Then he turned to the ledger. This was the real book. Not the one for public eyes, not the one slid across the counter to anxious mothers and inquiring lawyers. This was the cash book, the one Judge Elias Thorne kept in his private office safe, the one Micah had found himself alone with tonight under the pretense of quarterly archiving. Its leather was thick, oily, smelling of cigar smoke and bourbon. The entry was stark, nestled between a land deed transfer and a fine for public intoxication. I Dunn, labor contract, sold. Silver Creek Mining Company, $50. $50. The price of a good horse. The price of his brother. The price of a soul. There was no charge listed, no trial, no verdict, just a name reduced to an initial and a transaction that smelled of the pit. He didn't need the match for this one. The small fire in the filing drawer was growing, licking at other files, tasting the dust of a decade of injustice. Smoke, thin and acrid, began to snake around the metal edges. It smelled like truth. Micah took the oil lamp from the judge's desk. The glass was warm. He remembered Isaac, grinning, saying once that Micah had ink for blood and paper for skin, that he was a man made of stationery, neat and ordered and easily filed away. Isaac was the one made of wind and grit, all motion and loud laughter, too big for any room he ever stood in, too wild for any law to hold. That's what they said when they took him. Too wild. A danger to the peace. A vagrant, even though he had a brother with a clean collar and a steady job right here in the courthouse that was supposed to protect him. A brother who had promised their mother on her deathbed that he would always, always look after Isaac. Micah upended the lamp. Oil splashed across the ledger, soaking the leather, pooling in the grooves of the judge's meticulous accounts. It ran over the $50 entry, making the ink shimmer, blurring the line between a man's life and a business expense. The smoke was thicker now, clawing at his throat. The heat from the filing cabinet was a solid presence at his back. He didn't look back. He tossed the lamp, glass shattering with a satisfying final crash. The oil ignited with a whump that shook the floorboards. Flame roared up the side of the judge's oak desk, a beautiful, terrible orange that swallowed the ledger whole. It climbed the drapes, tasted the wood paneling. The fire was speaking now, a language everyone in this town of Providence understood better than Scripture, the language of cleansing, the language of endings. He walked out of the judge's chambers, leaving the door open. He didn't run. He walked with the measured pace of a clerk who had just finished his duties for the day. He passed Deputy Miller's empty desk, the inkwell still uncapped, a half-written marriage license waiting for morning. He walked past the witness stand, a lonely, scarred piece of wood where men swore on a Bible they didn't read to a truth they didn't possess. He paused in the center of the courtroom, the heart of the building. The scales of justice, brass and tarnished, sat on the judge's bench. He reached out and touched one of the pans. It was cold. He imagined it tipped not with evidence, but with cinders, with the ash of his brother's name. The smell of smoke was a living thing now, pouring into the courtroom. A distant shout from the street outside. A single bell began to clang, frantic and high. Micah looked at the judge's high-backed chair, the throne from which Elias Thorne had pronounced Isaac deceased, while counting the 50 silver dollars that said otherwise. He could see the indentation in the leather where the man's self-satisfied weight had settled day after day. He could almost smell him. Micah turned his back on it and walked out the main doors of the Gallatin County Courthouse. The cool night air hit his face, but it couldn't touch the heat inside him. The fire he had started was a beacon, painting the bell tower in flickering light. People were running now, shouting. He pulled the brim of his hat low and melted into the growing crowd, just another face, watching the flames. His face lit by the inferno he had made. He was no longer Micah Dunn, clerk. The fire had burned that man away. What was left was just a name, a promise, and a reckoning that had just begun. The records were ash. Now, justice could begin. He walked west, away from the light, away from the town of Providence. The shouting and the clang of the fire bell faded behind him, replaced by the crunch of his own boots on the gravel road. Every step was a declaration. Every breath of clean, cold air was a betrayal of the smoky memory of the courthouse. He had no plan, only a destination. Silver Creek Mining Company. The name was branded on his mind, clearer than any word he'd ever written in ink. He had a little money saved, tucked in his boot. Not $50, more. Enough to buy a horse, a gun, and a new life that was only a continuation of the old one's broken promise. He didn't sleep. Sleep was a luxury for men with clear consciences or for the dead. He was neither. He was a ghost haunting the living, and his first stop was the horse trader on the edge of town, a man named Silas who cheated on weights and bloodlines but whose animals had stamina. "Leaving town in a hurry, Dunn?" Silas asked, his eyes lingering on the orange glow that still stained the sky to the east. "Business," Micah said. The word felt foreign, a piece of his old life. His voice was raw from the smoke, a stranger's voice. He bought a rangy bay mare with mean eyes and strong legs. He bought a used saddle, the leather cracked like old promises. He didn't haggle. He paid the man's first price and rode out before the sun could cast his shadow long on the road. The desert opened up before him, a vast, empty ledger waiting for a new entry. He rode hard, the motion a punishment and a prayer. With every mile, the clerk fell away. The soft hands that knew only the feel of paper and the smooth wood of a pen grew raw on the reins. The shoulders, rounded from bending over desks, straightened with a new, hard purpose. He thought of Isaac, not as a name on a page, but as a boy. Isaac, 10 years old, pulling him from the creek after he'd fallen through the ice, his face blue with cold and fear. Isaac's grip strong and sure, laughing even as his own teeth chattered. "Always got you, Micah. Always." A promise made by a child, more binding than any sworn oath on a courthouse Bible. Days bled together. He learned the rhythm of the horse, the burn of the sun, the gnawing ache of a hunger that wasn't just for food. He ate jerky and hardtack, the taste of ash always in his mouth. He was following the map he'd memorized from the county surveyor's office, a web of lines leading to the bleak territory where the Silver Creek Mining Company tore the guts out of the earth. He was a man of paper, and he knew that even corruption left a paper trail, a receipt, a wage slip, a grave marker. Something. He would find it. He would find what they did to his brother. He stopped in dusty, forgotten towns that were little more than a saloon and a blacksmith. In one, he bought a gun, a Colt Peacemaker, heavy and solid in his hand. The gunsmith showed him how to load it, how to sight it, how to clean it. Micah's hands, so deft with a quill, were clumsy with the weapon. But he learned. He practiced out in the scrubland, the recoil jarring his arm, the sound a physical blow. The first few shots were wild, gouging the dirt. But he was a meticulous man. He learned the trigger pull, the heft, the tiny adjustments needed to send lead where he willed it. He was aiming at a rock, but he saw Judge Thorne's face. He saw the cold, dismissive eyes of the law that had judged his brother worth less than a beast of burden. The shots grew steadier. The groupings tightened. He spoke to no one unless he had to. He asked quiet questions. "Heard of the Silver Creek mine?" Some men spat. Some men's eyes went hard and flat. "Stay away from there," a grizzled prospector told him in a bar that smelled of stale beer and regret. "That ain't a mine. It's a boneyard. They don't hire men, they buy 'em. And they don't pay out in silver, they pay out in dirt." The prospector's words were stones dropping into the well of Micah's rage. He was on the right path. He remembered Isaac trying to teach him to fight. Micah was all books and numbers. Isaac was all fists and fury. "You think too much," Isaac had said, easily sidestepping Micah's clumsy swing. "Just feel it. Just let it go." Micah hadn't understood then. He understood now. The thinking was done. The careful weighing of options, the search for precedent, the belief in process, all that had burned with the courthouse. Now there was only the feeling, a cold, hard certainty that was heavier than the gun on his hip. Weeks later, the landscape changed. The dusty plains gave way to rocky, broken hills scarred with tailings piles, monuments to greed. The air grew thin and tasted of metal. He saw the mine before he reached it. A great open wound in the side of a mountain, smoke pluming from a smelter, the distant rhythmic clang of hammers on steel, a constant metallic heartbeat. This was the place. This was where the ledger had sent him. Silver Creek. It looked like hell, scraped clean of heaven. He didn't ride in. He tethered the mare in a hidden arroyo and went the rest of the way on foot, climbing the rocks, keeping low. He was a clerk. He knew how to be invisible. He spent 2 days watching the mine. He saw the men. They weren't miners. They were prisoners. Gaunt figures in rags, their faces coated in grime, their movements slow and spiritless. They were overseen by guards with shotguns and mean, hardened faces. They moved the men in lines, from a squalid bunkhouse to the mine entrance, from the mine to the mess hall. There was no laughter. There was no talk. Only the clang of steel and the barked orders of the guards. He looked for Isaac's face in every line of men. He searched for that familiar, lanky frame, the easy way he moved. But he saw only strangers, their humanity stripped away, their faces masks of exhaustion and despair. Was he here? Was he alive? The hope was a sickness, a shard of glass in his gut. He had to know. He needed a name, a record. Even here, in this lawless pit, there had to be a record. A paymaster, a foreman, someone who kept the books. He found his way in at night. The camp was loud with the snores of exhausted men and the drunken talk of the guards in their separate cabin. He slipped past the perimeter, a shadow moving between shadows. He found the foreman's office, a small shack separate from the bunkhouses. The lock was simple. He'd spent his life around keys and locks. This one was an insult. He was inside in seconds. The office smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. A single lantern cast a low glow. And there, on the desk, was a ledger. Not as fine as Judge Thorne's. This one was battered, its cover stained with coffee and something that looked like blood. He opened it. His hands didn't shake. He was beyond shaking. The names were listed, crudely written. And next to them, dates and notations. Jones, T-leg injury, terminated. Sanchez, R, escape attempt, terminated. Terminated. A clean corporate word for murder. He ran his finger down the list of names. His heart was a hammer against his ribs. And then he saw it. Not I. Dunn. The foreman here had no need for such coyness. Isaac Dunn. The name leaped off the page. He traced the letters. The ghost of his brother's life captured in cheap ink. He followed the line across the page. There was a date of arrival, matching the time he would have been transported from Providence, and then a final entry, dated 6 months ago. The word wasn't sold. It wasn't deceased. It wasn't terminated. It was worse. Isaac Dunn, cave-in, Unrecoverable, unrecoverable, buried alive, lost in the gut of the mountain he was forced to dig, all for $50. Micah stared at the word. The hope he hadn't even realized he was still carrying, the tiny, stupid ember of it, went out. It didn't die with a sigh. It was snuffed out, leaving behind an absolute cold. Isaac had believed Micah would find him. He'd probably believed it right up until the moment the rock and darkness took him. He had died, waiting for a brother who was still dutifully filing papers, believing in a justice that had sold him for pocket money. Micah closed the book. The grief was a physical thing, a giant hand squeezing his chest, stealing his breath. But beneath it, something else crystallized. The fire he'd set in the courthouse was an act of rage. This was different. This was a verdict. The foreman, the guards, the Silver Creek Mining Company, and the man who signed the order, Judge Elias Thorne. They were all guilty, and the sentence was death. He stood there in the dark shack, the sounds of the camp outside fading into a dull roar. He was no longer a clerk, no longer just a brother seeking vengeance. He was the judge now, he was the jury, and he was the executioner. He tore the page with his brother's name from the ledger. He folded it carefully, the way he would have folded a legal document, and put it in his breast pocket. It was the only record that mattered now. He left the shack as quietly as he entered. But the man who walked out into the cold mountain night was not the same one who had picked the lock. The fire in his soul had burned down to embers, but they glowed with a heat that would never, ever go out. He watched the mine for another week. He was patient. He was a clerk. He knew how to study a system to find its weaknesses. He learned the guards' routines, the shift changes, the path the foreman took from his shack to the mine entrance. He learned which guards were lazy, which were cruel, which drank the most. He was a ghost on the mountainside, his grief a lens that brought everything into sharp, brutal focus. He wasn't planning a battle. He was orchestrating a collapse. He started with the water. The pipe that fed the camp from a mountain spring was exposed for a 50-yard stretch along a high ridge. He worked at night, using a rock to hammer the iron pipe, denting it, weakening it. He didn't break it. Not yet. He just prepared it. He did the same to the supports of the narrow wooden bridge that crossed the chasm leading to the main road, the only way in or out for a wagon. He sawed halfway through the thick timbers, stuffing the cuts with mud and rock to hide his work. Small acts of sabotage, undermining the foundation. It was what he knew. The foreman was a man named Calloway, a big man with a gut and a beard stained with tobacco juice. Micah watched him beat a worker for dropping a tool, the sound of the fist on flesh echoing in the thin air. In that moment, Calloway ceased to be a man. He became a symbol. He became a line item in a ledger of sin. Micah would take him last. He wanted him to see his kingdom fall apart first. He started with the guards. The two who patrolled the northern perimeter were the laziest. They liked to sit behind a rock outcropping and share a bottle. Micah waited for them. He came up behind them as silent as a tax notice. He didn't use his gun. The sound would raise the alarm. He used a rock, the same kind of rock that had buried his brother. The first guard went down without a sound, his skull giving way with a sickening crunch. The second turned, his eyes wide with surprise, the bottle slipping from his fingers. Micah's blow was clumsy, but fueled by a cold rage that lent it strength. The man fell, gurgling. Micah dragged their bodies into a ravine and took their shotguns and ammunition. He was armed now, truly armed. The next night, under the cover of a storm that rolled in over the peaks, he made his move on the camp itself. The wind howled, masking sound. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dust to mud. It was chaos sent from heaven. He went to the ridge and, with a heavy sledgehammer he'd stolen from the blacksmith's shed, he finished his work on the water pipe. It ruptured with a great groan, sending the camp's water supply cascading down the mountainside. Then he went to the dynamite shed. The lock was heavy, but he had the foreman's keys now, taken from his office during another midnight visit. He took a dozen sticks of dynamite, fuses, and caps. He didn't go for the bunkhouse. The men inside were victims, same as Isaac. He went for the structures of power, the guards' barracks, the foreman's office, the smelter. He planted the charges, his hands swift and sure in the dark. He worked with the methodical precision of an auditor closing the books on a bankrupt company. Each charge placed was a line drawn, a debt called in. He set the fuses long. He wanted them to see it coming. As he worked, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Isaac, after a fistfight in town, his lips split and his eye swelling, Micah had been tending to him, dabbing the cut with witch hazel. "Why do you do it, Isaac? Why do you always have to fight?" Isaac had looked at him, his one good eye clear and serious. "Because some things, Micah, you can't talk your way out of. Some things are just wrong, and you gotta hit 'em. You gotta hit 'em hard." Micah lit the first fuse, then the second, then the third. He moved back up the hillside, a phantom in the storm. The explosions were not simultaneous. They were a sequence, a punctuation mark at the end of a long, bloody sentence. The guards' barracks went first, a roar of splintering wood and shattered glass. Then the foreman's office, the little shack where he'd found Isaac's name, vanished in a flash of yellow-white light, sending flaming papers spinning into the storm like fiery moths. The last and biggest explosion was the smelter, the heart of the operation. It went up with a deep, gut-shaking boom that echoed off the mountains, a sound of final judgment. Metal screamed and twisted. The fire from it lit up the entire camp, a scene from Dante's Inferno. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, shouting, confused. The remaining guards were disorganized, running in the mud, their authority washed away by the rain and fire. And then Calloway appeared, bellowing, a pistol in his hand. He stood there, framed against the burning smelter, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. This was the moment. Micah raised the shotgun he'd taken. The range was long, but the sight was clear. He could end it. He could kill the man who wrote unrecoverable next to his brother's name. But Isaac's voice echoed in his head. "You gotta hit him hard." Killing him from a distance was an execution. It wasn't a reckoning. Calloway had to know who had done this. He had to know why. Micah started walking down the hill, toward the fire, toward the chaos. He held the shotgun at his side. He was no longer hiding. He was no longer a ghost. He walked into the light of the fires he had set, his face grim, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. A few of the workers saw him, this stranger appearing out of the storm, and they backed away, their eyes wide with fear, and something else. Awe. Calloway saw him too. He raised his pistol. "Who the hell are you?" He roared over the storm and the fire. Micah didn't answer. He just kept walking, his steps steady in the sucking mud. The clerk was gone. The Avenger was here, and court was now in session. The rain was the gavel, and the fire was the witness. Calloway fired his pistol. The shot went wide, the bullet zinging past Micah's ear into the night. Fear did that. It ruined a man's aim. Micah felt nothing. He kept walking, closing the distance. He saw the foreman's face change from anger to confusion, and then to a dawning, animal terror. He saw the man realize this wasn't a random act. This was personal. "For Isaac Dunn," Micah said, his voice quiet, but carrying in a lull in the wind. The name hung in the air between them, more powerful than any bullet. He saw the flicker of recognition in Calloway's eyes. He remembered the name, he remembered the cave-in, he remembered the ledger. It was all there, in a fleeting second of comprehension. That was all Micah needed. He raised the shotgun. Calloway tried to fire again, fumbling with his pistol, his bravado gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic scramble. Micah was faster. The shotgun blast was a deafening roar that cut through the storm. It took Calloway in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the mud. He lay there, a broken thing, the firelight glinting on the blood spreading across his shirt. Micah stood over him. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt a vast, hollow emptiness. He had balanced this one page of the ledger. But the book was thick, and the main account was still outstanding. He turned and looked at the other men. the prisoners of the mine. They were staring at him, at the body of Calloway, at the burning camp. Their faces were unreadable in the flickering light. He had not freed them, he had only broken their cage. What they did now was up to them. He saw one man bend down and pick up Calloway's pistol. Another kicked one of the dead guards. A slow, spreading murmur went through the crowd. It was the sound of men remembering they were men. Micah turned his back on them all. He walked away from the fire, away from the body, back toward the arroyo where his horse was waiting. The rain was letting up. The storm was passing. He had the page from the ledger in his pocket, the one with his brother's name. It was soaked through now, the ink likely running. It didn't matter. He didn't need to read it anymore. He had become the record. His work here was done, but he wasn't finished. There was one more name in the book, a bigger name, Judge Elias Thorne. And Providence was a long ride from here. He mounted his horse and rode east, back toward the town that thought he was just another column in a ledger of ash. The ride back to Providence was a pilgrimage in reverse. He rode away from a grave and toward a reckoning. The land that had seemed vast and empty on the way out now felt like a cage, with Providence at its center, a town built on a foundation of lies he himself had helped to mortar. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted man who had fled the fire. The mine had hardened him, baked the grief into his bones, leaving something solid and unyielding. The sun had leathered his skin, and his eyes, once accustomed to the dim light of the records room, were now narrowed and sharp, constantly scanning the horizon. He moved with a purpose that was as stark and brutal as the landscape around him. He was a living testament to a crime, and he was coming to testify. He didn't ride into town. He sold the bay mare in a settlement 2 days' ride away, trading her for a scruffy pack mule and the clothes of a dirt-poor prospector. He let his beard grow, rubbing dust into it until it was gray and matted. He stooped his shoulders, mimicked a limp. He became another piece of the desperate scenery, a man beaten down by the land, invisible in his poverty. He entered Providence on foot, a ghost returning to his own haunting ground. The town had changed, or maybe he had. The courthouse had been rebuilt, a proud new structure of brick and fresh-sawn lumber, a monument to the town's resilience, or its capacity to bury the past under a new facade. A new clerk sat at Miller's old desk. A new judge's name was painted on the door of the chambers he had torched. But Judge Elias Thorne was still there. He hadn't fled. He had ascended. He was no longer a county judge. He was a senatorial candidate. His face was on posters plastered on every wall, a portrait of civic virtue and steadfast leadership. The posters spoke of order and progress and a firm hand for a secure future. Micah tore one down in a dark alley, crumpling the smiling, lying face in his fist. Thorne hadn't just covered his tracks. He'd paved them over and was building a highway to power on top of them. Micah spent his days doing odd jobs, sweeping out the saloon, mucking stables, listening. He was a confessional for drunks and gossips. He learned that the official story of the fire was that it had been set by a disgruntled vagrant who perished in the flames, a convenient, nameless scapegoat. Micah Dunn, the clerk, was listed among the dead, a tragic loss. He had a tombstone in the town cemetery, a small, neat marker paid for by the county. He visited it once, at dusk. Micah Dunn, faithful servant of the law. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He stood over his own grave and felt nothing but the cold weight of the task ahead. He learned Thorne's routines. The man was insulated by his new status, surrounded by aides and supporters. He gave speeches on the steps of the new courthouse, his voice booming with false sincerity. He spoke of the sanctity of the law, the importance of records, the unwavering march of justice. Micah watched from the crowd, a shabby ghost amidst the hopeful faces, and felt a rage so pure it was almost calm. Thorne didn't just deal in death, he dealt in erasure. He had erased Isaac from the world, and then he had erased Micah, replacing them both with convenient fictions that served his ambition. Micah knew he couldn't just shoot him. A dead candidate was a martyr. A dead man tells no tales. The town had already proven its willingness to believe a lie. He needed a confession. He needed Thorne to tear down his own monument. He needed to turn Thorne's greatest weapon, the public trust, against him. He needed a courtroom, not the new one of brick and polished wood, but a courtroom of the people's own making. He needed proof. The burned ledger was gone. The page from the mine was just a dead man's word against a senator-in-waiting. He needed a living witness. He remembered the name from Judge Thorne's private ledger, the one he'd burned, the line item beneath his brother's. Silver Creek Mining Company payment received via C. Abernathy, Wells Fargo agent, Junction City. The money had to pass through hands. Abernathy. That was the link. That was the piece of the paper trail that hadn't burned. Junction City was 100 miles south, a major transit hub. Micah left Providence as quietly as he had arrived, a whisper of a man leaving a town of ghosts. He rode the rails, a stowaway in a cattle car, the smell of the animals a welcome change from the cloying scent of Providence's lies. In Junction City, he found the Wells Fargo office. He watched it for days, learning the rhythm, the faces. Abernathy was a nervous man with a thin mustache and darting eyes, a man who looked like he was constantly counting money in his head, a man drowning in small complicities. Micah didn't confront him in the office. He followed him home. He waited until the house was dark and quiet. He picked the lock on the back door, a skill he was now more comfortable with than penmanship, and found Abernathy in his bed. The man woke with a gun barrel pressed to his temple. "Don't scream," Micah said, his voice a low rasp. Abernathy's eyes were wide in the moonlight filtering through the window. He was paralyzed with terror. "You manage payments for Judge Elias Thorne to the Silver Creek Mining Company," Micah said. It wasn't a question. "You facilitated the sale of men. One of them was my brother." Abernathy started to blubber, to deny. Micah pressed the gun harder. "The ledger's burned," Micah said calmly. "But you keep your own records. A man like you always does. Insurance. A little black book. Where is it?" The man's will crumbled. He was not a man of violence. He was a creature of numbers and quiet, profitable sins. He nodded toward a floorboard under the rug. Micah kept the gun on him while he pulled it up. There it was, a small, leather-bound notebook. Micah flipped it open. It was all there. Dates, names, amounts. Coded, but not for a man who knew what he was looking for. Thorne's name wasn't there, of course. Just an initial. T, but the dates matched, the amounts matched, and there were others, dozens of names over the years, sent to the mine, to railroad gangs, to logging camps. A whole shadow economy of human souls, managed by this trembling man and authorized by the Honorable Elias Thorne. Isaac was just one of many. "You and I are going back to Providence," Micah said. "You are going to tell everyone what is in this book." Abernathy wept. "He'll kill me." "I'll kill you if you don't," Micah said. The choice was simple, certain death now, or possible death later. Abernathy made the only choice he could. They rode back to Providence, Micah never more than 2 feet from his witness. Abernathy was a broken man, his composure stripped away, leaving only the raw fear of a petty criminal finally facing a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. When they reached the outskirts of town, Micah didn't take him to the sheriff. The sheriff was Thorne's man. He took him to the church. It was a Sunday. The pews would be full. He marched Abernathy up the aisle, right in the middle of the sermon. The preacher stopped, his mouth agape. The congregation turned, a sea of shocked and disapproving faces. Micah didn't care. He pushed Abernathy toward the pulpit. "This man has a confession to make," he announced, his voice ringing out in the holy silence. He pulled out the Colt, not aiming it at anyone, but just holding it. It was a symbol of an authority the church could not grant and the law would not recognize. "Tell them," Micah ordered Abernathy. "Tell them about Judge Thorne. Tell them about the men he sold." And Abernathy, weeping, shaking, his voice cracking, began to talk. He confessed it all. The money, the ledgers, the coded messages, the sale of vagrants, debtors and troublemakers to labor camps they never returned from. He named names. He gave dates. The church was utterly silent, the only sound Abernathy's pathetic, choked sobs and the rustle of his trembling hands on the little black book. He got to Isaac's name. Isaac Dunn, he read out. Sold. $50. A gasp went through the crowd. People knew the Dunn boys. They remembered Isaac. They remembered the quiet, diligent clerk, Micah. From the back of the church, a voice boomed. Lies! Slander from a madman! It was Judge Thorne. He had been there, in the back pew, polishing his image as a God-fearing man. He stood now, his face purple with rage, his aides moving to flank him. This is a conspiracy. This wretch is a known embezzler I had dismissed, and that is the vagrant who burned down our courthouse. He pointed a finger at Micah. For the first time, the townspeople really looked at the dusty, bearded man holding the gun. They saw past the grime and the rags. They saw the clerk they thought was dead. The silence broke. Shouts erupted. Confusion reigned. Some people moved toward Micah, others toward Thorne. The sanctuary was becoming a courtroom, a mob, a tinderbox. This was it. The climax. Micah looked from the cowering Abernathy to the roaring Thorne. He saw the faces of the townsfolk, caught between the lie they had lived with and the truth that was tearing their world apart. He could kill Thorne now, right here. End it. A single bullet and the man who murdered his brother would be dead. The rage screamed for it. The cold, hard purpose that had driven him for months demanded it. But then he looked at the little black book in Abernathy's hand. He looked at the faces of the people. Killing Thorne would make him a murderer. It would validate Thorne's final lie, that Micah was just another violent vagrant. But forcing him to stand trial, here, now, before the very people he had deceived. That was justice. That was making the man undo himself, word by word. It was a reckoning, not just a revenge. He had to hit him hard, and the hardest blow wouldn't be a bullet. It would be the truth, spoken in Thorne's own voice. You won't make it to the Senate, Micah said, his voice cutting through the din. You won't even make it to the courthouse. He leveled his gun, not at Thorne's heart, but at his face. You're going to stand right here, in God's house, and you're going to tell them what you did. You're going to tell them about my brother. You're going to tell them all. Thorne's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. His power was built on his voice, his reputation, the weight of his office. To be commanded by a dead man in a church was an impossibility. I will not, he snarled. Micah cocked the hammer of the Colt. The sound, a simple mechanical click, was louder than all the shouting. It was the sound of a final, irrevocable choice being made. The next voice they hear will be yours confessing, Micah said, his voice deadly calm. Or it will be the only voice they hear, because you'll be dead and I'll be gone. But they have the book now. They have Abernathy. They will know the truth either way. The only question is whether you die a liar or not. Thorne stared down the barrel of the gun. He looked at the hard, unforgiving eyes of the man he had tried to erase. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, their expressions turning from confusion to suspicion to dawning horror. He saw his legacy, his ambition, his entire world of carefully constructed lies collapsing in on him. There was no escape. The clerk had audited his soul and found it bankrupt. The judge was trapped in a courtroom he could not control, before a jury that had already heard the evidence. His shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him. The booming voice of the candidate shrank to the querulous whine of a guilty man. He opened his mouth, and the first word of his confession was a surrender. Micah had won. He hadn't fired a shot. He had simply held up a mirror, and the monster had been forced to look. Thorne's confession was a ruin. It came out in halting, self-pitying pieces, but it came out. He admitted to the scheme, framing it as a necessary evil to clean up the county, to remove undesirable elements. He tried to justify it, to dress the raw greed in the robes of civic duty. But the core of it was rotten, and everyone in that church could smell it. When he finally spoke Isaac's name, admitting he had falsified the death certificate and sold him to the mine, a woman in the front pew, a mother who had lost a son to a bar fight Isaac was blamed for, began to weep. The sound broke the spell. The town's grief, suppressed and misdirected for years, finally found its true target. The crowd surged forward, no longer a congregation, but a mob. They bypassed Micah. He was irrelevant now. Their fury was for the man in the fine suit who had traded their sons and brothers for silver and power. Micah stepped back, letting the wave of human anger wash over the space where he stood. He watched as Thorne's aides were pushed aside, as hands reached for the judge, tearing at his clothes, his face a canvas of pure terror. He saw Abernathy, forgotten, scuttling away into the chaos. Micah's part was done. He had delivered the evidence. He had compelled the testimony. The verdict and the sentence now belonged to the people of Providence. He slipped out the side door of the church, the sounds of righteous fury fading behind him. He didn't look back. He walked through the empty Sunday streets, a man who had completed his only purpose. The world felt quiet, hollow. The fire in him had burned down to cold ash. He didn't go to his own false grave. He didn't go to the new courthouse. He walked to the old lot where the first courthouse had stood, the place where his reckoning had begun. The new building was 100 yards away, gleaming and proud. But here, there was only a patch of scorched earth, slowly being reclaimed by weeds, a scar on the face of the town. He walked to Judge Thorne's house. The door was unlocked. The place was empty, silent. He walked through the rooms, a ghost in the home of the man who had destroyed his life. It was a house built on lies, furnished with blood money. He went into Thorne's study. It was opulent, lined with leather-bound books that had never been read, a decanter of expensive whiskey on the desk. This was where Thorne had counted his $50. This was where he had planned his ascent, his path to the Senate paved with the bones of men like Isaac. Micah looked around the room, at the records of a life of prosperous evil. He felt no urge to burn them. The papers were meaningless now. The truth was out, a wildfire spreading through the town. You can't burn a rumor. You can't burn a memory. He looked at the judge's chair, a high-backed throne of dark leather and carved oak, identical to the one in the old courthouse, the one he had spared from the flames. It was the seat of power, the place where a man could sit and sign a paper that turned another man from a human being into a commodity. It was the source, the symbol of the whole damn lie. He dragged the heavy chair out of the study, scraping long grooves in the polished hardwood floor. He hauled it through the house and out into the front yard, into the middle of the manicured lawn. He went back inside and got the whiskey from the desk. He stood before the chair, a dark altar in the afternoon sun, and poured the expensive liquor all over the leather, watching it soak in. Then he took out his last match. He struck it on his boot heel. The flame sputtered to life, a tiny, defiant sun. He held it to the whiskey-soaked seat. It caught with a soft whoosh, blue flames dancing over the leather before turning a hungry, brilliant orange. He didn't take the records. He took the chair and watched it burn.